Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, we all know the story of Paul Revere, right? Riding the horse to warn his Patriot colleagues that the British Army was coming to Lexington and Concord during the Revolutionary War. Well, perhaps you haven't heard a similar story, and this one involves the British attack on Danbury back in 1777. A 16-year-old girl, Sybil Ludington, is said to have ridden 40 miles throughout eastern New York State in the pouring rain to wake up Patriot militia to come to Danbury's aid. But not every historian believes this story. Some think it's more legend than reality. Well, here today to share his substantial background research on this story is Vinny DiCino. He's a former English teacher turned historian sleuth who says he's compiled the evidence that shows it happened. He's written 4 books on Sybil, including The Call to Arms and Patriot Hero. He's going to be along in just a moment with his fabulous story. This week's trivia question: what do the years 1888, 1938, 1978, and 2018 all have in common in Connecticut? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Have you ever ridden a horse galloping in pouring rain for 40 miles in one clip? Well, if you have, my hat's off to you. Even Paul Revere didn't do that. He only rode 20 miles when he called out the British were coming, and it wasn't raining. Well, today we talk about a 16-year-old girl who did go on such a ride, and her name was Sybil Ludington. And just like Paul Revere, she was warning Patriot militia about the British, this time their attack on the supply depot at Danbury back in 1777. The problem is, not everybody believes the story. The people who don't believe it tend to be professional historians. Now, they live by very specific rules about proving historic events, and some say that Sybil's ride is folklore, a great legend, but more imagined than real. Well, our guest today takes a very different stance, and personally, I've never met anybody yet who knows Sybil Ludington's story better than Vince DiCino. He, by the way, prefers to be called Vinny. He's written 4 books, 2 for kids and 2 for adults about Sybil Ludington. And it makes sense because he was an English teacher and he taught people how to write, and he did that in New York State for 35 years before retiring. Well, one day he was out driving and he saw one of those historic marker signs. You've seen them. The sign was one of the markers showing the route that Sybil rode that night. Well, Vince was intrigued, and he had never really heard about Sybil, and says he even felt a little bit embarrassed that he had lived so long without knowing the story. Well, Vince took an instant interest in her tale and started researching. And what he found out about Sybil herself was incredibly inaccurate, and his quest to write the record on her accelerated. Well, the basics of that 1777 evening were accurate enough. Generals David Worcester and Benedict Arnold had come to Danbury's defense, along with the head of the Fairfield County militia, Gold Silliman. And once the British left Danbury, they did march on to Ridgefield, where a battle took place, and Worcester would be killed and Benedict Arnold nearly killed. And all of this news stole the headlines for that event, and Sybil's ride didn't get any coverage in the papers. Well, what Vinny uncovered is a large body of evidence, all of which points to Sybil having conducted the ride. Sybil died in 1839. She was 77 years old. And 62 years after her ride, she finally passed away. Well, 15 years later, after she died in 1854, Danbury was memorializing General Worcester, who had been killed in the battle, and a letter was sent by Sybil's family to the event coordinator asking that a mention be made of her exploits. Unfortunately, that mention was not made. Now, 40 years after Sybil had died, in 1880, a New York City historian by the name of Mabel Lamb wrote a book, and in it, she referenced Sybil's ride. In 1907, almost 7 decades after Sybil had passed away, her family self-published a book giving more details about this ride. The account was based on a diary written by Sybil's father, Henry Ludington, and he was the colonel in charge of the militia in eastern New York State near Danbury that night. Well, finally, in 1940, a poem was written about her exploits and circulated nationally, and a lot of people have heard it. We'll go over it. And in 1961, the famous sculptor Anna Hyatt Huntington created two statues of Sybil, one at Lake Glenida in Carmel, New York, and the other in the plaza at the entrance to Danbury Library. A third statue, incidentally, does exist in Washington, D.C. Add to this, in 1975, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring Sybil. And in 2015, not too long ago, a 35-page research article was written on Sybil by a woman named Paula Hunt, which yielded even more additional information. Finally, some evidence that has not been widely seen or reported includes a family letter in which a person wrote down that she heard the story directly from Sybil, and she recounts that tale in her letter. Now, I don't want to give away any more before the interview, so let me introduce the man who's put all this together, Vinny DeCino. So, Vinny, I want to start off saying that it's a pleasure to chat with you because it's really admirable what you're doing. And we're going to get into what you're doing, why you're doing it later on, but it's very impressive the amount of information you have pulled together on Sybil Ludington and what she did or did not do that night and her family and everything else. It's, to me, almost a fight between historians because everywhere I go, nobody questions whether Sybil Ludington took that ride or not. They accept it at face value, but unfortunately, there's a lot of historians, and they have good reasons for challenging and being skeptical. We're going to get into that. And you've come back almost Don Quixote-like and have proven some incredible things. So we're going to get into all this. What I want to start off with is I think people love this story. It was April 26, 1777. Danbury's getting attacked by the British. They're burning a good portion of Danbury. It's pouring rain, and a soldier arrives at Sybil Ludington's house about 25 miles away in New York State. Pick up the story. What happened that night?
Pouring rain. Messenger comes to the door, pounds on the door, and says, "I have a message, sir, from 3 important generals." And he mentions Goldselleck Silman, he mentions David Wooster, and he mentions Benedict Arnold. When the colonel hears these names, he opens the door and says, "What goes on here?" He said, "Sir, Danbury's burning. General Tryon has come through Connecticut with 2,000 men. The rumor has it that he's killing young boys who will become soldiers someday. He burned houses. Rumor has it that his men got drunk. They burning Danbury. He said, 'We need your 400 men.' And the colonel said, 'It's Sunday night, 9 o'clock. My men are farmers. They're on their farms. They're asleep. I have no one to send.' Supposedly, Sybil said, 'Send me.' Reluctantly, he put her on a horse and sent her on a 40-mile journey. How's this girl going to know where to go? Well, Colonel had a grain mill, and he had gone to the men. She was the oldest child, more than likely went on a buckboard with him to deliver grain. This girl knew where to go, the only one who would have known where to go, especially at that time of night. So off she went, 40 miles through the woods, back home again. When she got home, she was cheered. She went to bed. He went to supposedly Danbury. On the way, he was told, "Hey, they're not in Danbury anymore. That's over. They're in Ridgefield." So he headed towards Ridgefield. David Wooster also did. He was shot in the back and killed that night.
So that's an incredible story. She does this for a night, and at age 16 has achieved more than most people do in their entire life, right? Let's just kind of follow so that people understand Sybil. So she ends up, she does this, and at 23, as you said before we started recording, they kind of put her in old maid category for those days, and she finally gets married. Who'd she marry, and what happened?
She married a man named Edmund Ogden, who, believe it or not, served in the Revolutionary War 3 times. Well, they ran a tavern near Route 22, near Paterson, New York. Well, the war was ending, and all the soldiers who went between New York and Connecticut stopped going. Business was gone. So he had to go to some place that would be the next New York City. So they went to the incredible metropolis of Catskill, New York. But they had something very special, steamships. So they were right on the Hudson. And all these ships that came through dropped men off. Where did the men go? To taverns. And they had already had experience with a tavern here. They could be rich. One problem. In 1799, he died. And when he died, this widow was left alone with a 13 or 14-year-old kid. And what was she going to do? So she opened a tavern of her own. 24 licenses were issued that year. She was the only female, and she ran that bar from 1803 to 1810, bought it for $500 and something, sold it for $2,000 when her son was old enough to get married. She was a single mother raising a child to be a lawyer. And at the time that they leave the tavern, take the money and go buy a house in Unadilla, New York, nowhere, it was in the middle of the woods. Her son, Henry, had a child, Edmund Augustus Ogden. She helped raise that child. Not only did she help raise that child, where did he end up going to school? West Point. What did he end up doing? He became a soldier. And not only a soldier, but a hero. He helped found Fort Riley in Kansas. And when cholera broke up, all the officers left. He stayed to nurse the women and children, and he died. So not only is Sybil a hero, she is the grandmother of a hero. She raised a child to be what she was.
When you stop to think about why has the legend sort of lived on, one of the reasons we still know about her is there have been a bunch of statues made of her. There's been a U.S. postage stamp named after her. She has her own Wikipedia page. A lot has been written about her. This Martha Lamb story in 1880. In 1907, finally this book comes out, and this guy works with the Ludington grandchildren, and they publish information largely contained in Colonel Ludington's diary, including the ride. And then finally, I want to point out there was a poem written by Burton Braley, who was quite a famous guy at the time. And, and people forget, Paul Revere was not known until 90 years after his death, when a guy named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote the poem of Paul Revere's Ride. And now Burton Braley comes along and does Sybil Ludington's Ride and starts it off with the famous word line, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of a lovely feminine Paul Revere." So there are all sorts of reasons why people know about her. Now, the point I'm coming to here is that there were reasons why historians doubt this. I'm just going to list these, and then we're going to come back and talk about all the reasons why you think this is wrong. The first thing that everybody points to is there's no contemporaneous mention. Nobody mentioned this in the newspaper at the time. There's nothing written from those years. That's number one. Number two, how troops were mustered in Dutchess County under Colonel Ludington. They wouldn't send a girl around to knock on doors. They would have these series of beacon lights. And then number three, when Sybil went for her widow's pension, her military widow's pension, she never mentioned that she did this ride. These are the three major reasons that people use to say, we doubt Sybil Ludington ever rode. You've done the research. Let's go back to number one, no contemporaneous mentions. Go ahead, floor's yours.
They wouldn't have mentioned it. For one thing, no one knew about it. So if no one knew about the ride, why would a historian write about something that no one knew about? So the story never came out. It wasn't that she didn't do it. It was that no one knew she did it. And she herself didn't realize the importance of the ride.
General Worcester was killed in this battle. Yes. Benedict Arnold had his horse shot out from under him and was almost killed. I mean, there was a lot of major news from this battle. And plus, to give, I hate to say it this way, but to give a woman, headline in those days was not nearly as important as giving Benedict Arnold and General Worcester.
Right, and especially since they didn't consider the people who told people to go to battle. They considered the people who went to battle. Those were the heroes, not the people who told them to go or told them about it. It was considered insignificant. Well, in those days, that was nothing, but we look back today and we say, oh my God, if she didn't, he never would have gone there. So it was important. And we realized that she was the daughter of a colonel who was wanted. If the enemy found out that she had aided and abetted their enemy, they would have killed her too. So I'm sure the colonel would have said, shut your mouth and don't tell anybody about this because you're going to get hurt. I've got enemies out there.
So let's go back to how troops were mustered. Now, supposedly they used a series of beacon lights.
Not so much lights, more likely bells. And they rang the bell to let people know. So what we believe, and what I definitely believe, is that she was sent out to go to the officers' homes. Then the officers would send out a signal to hit their regiment. Did she go to 400 men that night? Of course not. But she probably did go to the officers, and that's how they created the route that she took. But the real question is, who in the world would know where these men lived? They're farmers. They have 100 acres of land. You have to, and it's pouring rain, and there's no roads. She's going through woods and forests. So she would have been the only one who could have done that outside of her father. People say to me, he's a hell of a father. He sent his kid out like that. Why didn't he go? And when the men came in, who was going to greet them at the parade grounds and get them set up for the trip to Danbury? He had to be there. He couldn't be in both places. Well, why didn't he send his sons? His sons were like little kids. She was the oldest of the family. She was 16. The rest were babies. They couldn't go. How many people have been suggested as the possible riders? 0. No other name has ever been brought up in any of the literature to say, oh, well, this guy may have done it. There was no other guy. She definitely took that ride at night.
Now, she did not mention this when she filed for her pension. What's your thoughts on that?
She wouldn't, because she did not consider that a heroic act. It was matter of fact for her to do the things that she had to do. Think about what this girl's life was. Her mother married her father at 14. So her mother was a young woman. She had 12 children. By the time of the ride, she had 7 other children. She was babysitting and taking care of kids and doing chores. Her job was to serve her family, period. All she was doing was what she was supposed to be doing. And then it was considered normal. Today, we say, you give me a 16-year-old girl who would do what that girl did, and I'll give you a hero. There was no one to praise her for it. And certainly not her father. Her father, I'm sure, didn't want anyone to even know about this.
People who are listening to this already, I'm sure, have a great appreciation for the level of knowledge you have on Sybil Ludington. The point is, it wasn't always like this, right? Tell us this story. You're driving around New York State here in this region, and tell us what happened.
After I saw the sign on the side of the road that said she rode by this spot in 1777 to repel the British in Danbury with Colonel Ludington, I said, what you talking about? I had no idea. So I came here to the Mahopac Library, and I said, there was a guy standing there with a ponytail and glasses. I said, do you know Sybil Ludington? He said, she died in like 1839. Why don't you go to the vertical file? Well, I went to the vertical file, and it was like a Manhattan phone book. I said, holy cow, how did I not know this? So the more I read, the more I was amazed. One paragraph from the 1930s kept repeating over and over again. After her famous ride, she married Henry or Edward or Edmund Ogden. They didn't know which. Depended on the article. He was a lawyer in Catskill, New York. She had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Her son was a hero in Kansas. Oh, my God. I researched all of that, and none of it was true. There was nothing to back up any of that paragraph. I called up my publisher, and I said, hey, is this a totally made-up story here? What's going on? And then I was able to get to the bottom of it. and to see that a simple error in history books switched her son's name with her husband's. And because of that, they took all of the information from her son. Oh my God, he had 6 kids, 4 boys, 2 girls. He was a lawyer in Catskill, not her husband. Once I saw all that, I started putting it together and then looking for documents and found them. And I went to Washington, D.C. to get the pension records because she had to apply for a pension for her husband's 3-time service, which, again, was so frustrating because I submitted all the information I had to the Daughters of the American Revolution, who, in all fairness, have very specific rules about who is and isn't a national hero. So I said, okay, let me give you the information that I have so that you could see. Part of the information was that her husband served 3 times in the Revolutionary War. Guess what? They made him a patriot, not her. So I also tracked down one of her grandchildren, great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, still alive today, and tried to make her a DAR member through her grandmother. And because of my research, they made her one because of her grandfather.
So here we are recording this, and I don't normally do this in my podcast, but we're recording this in October of 2024. And anybody who's listening to this podcast in the future, understand that there's going to be a different version of this story. But here's where we are in this point in time, because I think this is fascinating what happened. Earlier this year, you got approached because of your research by the DAR saying, look, there may be an opportunity now to hit the Holy Grail and get her in as a national hero, and you have submitted this evidence. Explain to us the kinds of evidence that you have compiled that nobody else had until then, and how you found it.
The Ludington family has invited me to family reunions since 2000. I've gotten to know them. While I was doing the research for 2019, Patriot Hero of the Hudson Valley, I went to try to find information on Martha Lamb.
And Martha Lamb, just so people know, she's the one who wrote the book in 1880, just 40 years after Sybil died, mentioning her ride.
Paula Hunt had written an article, and she said that there was a mention in Martha Lamb's of a Ludington. So I said, aha! So I went through all of her notes. And I went to the man who was in charge of the records. And I said, God, this is frustrating. And he said, well, what are you trying to do? I said, I'm trying to get information on Sybil Ludington to prove that she did this famous ride. And he said, well, have you looked in the Ludington letters? I said, the what? He said, the Ludington letters. They were donated here in 2015. Are you telling me that there's letters here? He said, yes, they were donated by Jane Ludington. So when this guy said Jane Ludington, I said, oh, my God. So I called, and I said, Miss Ludington, my name is Vin DeQuino. She said, oh, the one that wrote the book? I said, yes. She said, oh, yes, I have that book. I said, did you donate some letters to the New York State Historical Society? She said, oh, yes, Vin. They were in a filing cabinet in the carriage house in the bottom drawer, and mice were starting to get at them. We had to do something, so I donated it to the library. I said, did you tell anybody? She said, well, I told the library. I said, oh, my God, these letters are sitting here without anyone's knowledge. So I started reading them, and I was shocked. There were letters written by Sybil, for Sybil, written to her brothers, written to her grandchildren, letters from her grandchildren, most of all, letters from 2 of her nephews who were so adamant about getting her and her father's names out where they belonged. So they wrote to all members of the family saying, look, do you have any letters from Aunt Sybil mentioning the ride? So finally, his sister wrote a letter and said, yes, I recall being with my grandmother and my grandfather, and Aunt Sybil told us about what happened on that night. So I said, oh my God, this is it. This is the smoking gun. Well, the DAR didn't believe that that was a smoking gun. They believed that it was simply family hearsay. And I said, there's a big difference between hearsay and history. When a family had a child, a marriage, a death, they handwrote it the best they could in the Bible. That was considered a document. And that was considered a legal mention. And yet this letter that was written by someone who was with Sybil herself is not considered. So after I wrote this book, I got a call from a member of the DAR who is a specialist. And she had done this for so many others. And she said to me, Vin, this letter is going to do it because it clearly states what happened, and she was with Sybil herself. But once again, the DAR said, that's family hearsay. So she is still trying to get people to understand that this is documentation. And I will continue fighting to let people understand. On that night, there was nobody there but the family. We have to rely on their information. They were the witnesses. So they told their families at family reunions, and that was recorded. Why would that not be considered proof of the ride?
Well, the disagreement over the validity of the family letters as documentation continues as of the recording of this episode, but there will eventually be a final ruling. Now, regardless of how that disagreement is settled, I like to believe that Sybil Ludington did make that ride, and that she is indeed a heroine of the American Revolution. Wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, there's one other big difference between the rides taken by Paul Revere and Sybil Ludington. Paul Revere, you see, had help. Two other riders went along on other routes just in case any one of them was captured. Sybil, well, she rode alone. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Vinny DeCino, retired New York English teacher and expert researcher on Revolutionary War heroine Sybil Ludington. He's written 4 books on Sybil, including The Call to Arms and Patriot Hero. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, what do the years 1888, 1938, 1978, and 2018 all have in common in Connecticut? Well, the answer is that some of the most ferocious weather events in state history occurred during those years, which all ended in the number 8. The blizzard of 1888, the hurricane of 1938, the snowstorm that closed Connecticut in 1978, and the macro-burst and tornadoes that ravaged Connecticut in 2018. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we'll examine those storms as well as the great floods of '55 and the effects climate change is likely to have on Connecticut weather. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.